there are almost no places in New York City that are named after the original New Yorkers. You've pretty much just got these and Gowanus. So we have the name, but the why is very fuzzy. Nobody knows what Gowanus means. Named after a chief, named after some trees, named after the water, nobody knows. Nobody knows, and yet Native Americans were here for thousands of years before the Europeans showed up and just basically went, an entire world has been paved over now. So this talk isn't about that lost culture per se, and it isn't about Gowanus specifically. It takes the confusion behind the name and uses it as a starting point to explore something that is citywide. Essentially, it's about this. Now, this is a flagpole in the Battery, and if people know one story about the Lenape Indians, it's the one that you see depicted here. The leader of the Dutch buys the island of Manhattan for a handful of beads from some half-naked guy. So these two are the stars of our foundation myth, and they're the ones that are represented more or less on the city seal. Do you recognize the official seal? I love the seal because you do even if you don't. How about now? That's right. These two are the guys who tell you if there are rats in your restaurant, or an acceptable number of rats. So you know them. And if you've read a book on New York history, you may know also that they have names. Now, when they drafted the official seal, they came up with an official description of it. And if you're a writer or a researcher and you want info on the symbols of New York City, this is the book you read. And here's a line. The two represent the unity between the Native Americans and the colonists. Dexter, a sailor, his arm, et cetera, description of Dexter, and Sinister, an Indian of Manhattan. So you got Dexter, a nice sturdy name for a sturdy chap, and Sinister, this shady, satanic name for the Indian. Now you see this printed in guides, and you can see this in Wikipedia, and the funny thing is, these aren't names. Some of you probably know. This is just Latin for left and right. This is the way that you talk about heraldry like this, and by the way, it's reversed because it's from the perspective of the seal. So Dexter, a sailor, on the right, a sailor, and on the left, an Indian. It's just a coincidence of word order that people accept that the Native American has this terrible name. Well, what was his name? Nobody knows. How about this? What did the Lenape call Europeans? Now, this we do know. They called them the Shuwanok, the salty people, ocean voyagers. Now, this is the very first description of Lenape by a European explorer. They came towards us very cheerfully, making great shouts of admiration, showing us where we might come to land most safely with our boat. Now, this cheerfulness and eagerness and helpfulness is something that you see repeated in a lot of the early descriptions. In fact, they were a little bit too cheerful for some people. The first pastor of New York complained that the Lenape used to come to his services and smoke tobacco and laugh. Says, they are entirely savage and wild, he said, uncivil and as stupid as garden poles. I'm not sure what a garden pole is, but I love this idea of Indians laughing in church. Settle down, savages, because if you don't believe in our God, you will be tortured forever in hell because he loves you so much. Stop laughing. Quit calling me salty. So the preacher went on to add that they are as treacherous as they are tall. Now think about that for a second. The Dutch didn't make a lot of effort to understand the Lenape, but they were impressed. They were on average taller, fitter, and had better teeth than Europeans. And incidentally, they didn't believe that they were created by the finger of God to have dominion over the earth, but that they grew from the earth, just like any plant. Now, imagine how that might influence the way that you feel about nature. So we know a little bit more about the guy on the left. But let's look again. There are a couple of interesting details here. Let's look what he's wearing. Now, that's a headdress. In fact, it's a war bonnet. It makes him kind of a cartoon Indian. I mean, a war bonnet is what you put on a Native American when you don't have any really clear idea of what a Native American looks like. But it's a real thing. It's a symbol of power and respect, and it was worn by a guy like this, a Plains Indian, 1,000 miles away. Now, I don't want to make too much of this fashion mistake. I mean, I wouldn't go around collecting inappropriate representations of headdresses and New York symbols and statues because that would be obsessive, and a little bit sad. But I do want to include this just to show you that it goes beyond New York. Now, this is a U.S. penny, and what is up with this lady? What happened was there was a delegation of Plains Indians to the capital, and the daughter of the engraver of the U.S. Mint begged the chiefs to wear one of the war bonnets, and finally he said, okay, and the engraver said, that's great, and this is the result. True story. So what about these beads? Now, in this book that we saw earlier, the state historian of New York, no less, says it very clearly. The Dutch got Manhattan from the Indians by giving them trinkets valued at 60 guilders or $24. Now, is this true? All we have of this exchange is one letter written in 1626 by a colonist. In fact, it's one sentence from one letter. No deed of sale, no mention of beads and trinkets. It goes like this: Our people are in good spirit and they live in peace. They have purchased the island of Manhattan from the savages for the value of 60 guilders. Now, there's a huge problem talking about guilders or dollars or whatever here, because the Lenape didn't really share our notion of money. I mean, money is just a convention that everybody agrees on. And I wanted to know more about this, so I asked the expert at the Numismatic Society here in the city, and he pulled this out of the vault for me. Now, this is the real thing. It's wampum. It's the beads everybody is talking about. And he said, listen, you drill it from clamshell and you polish it and it's hard to make, but it's valuable but not money. You can use it to trade things and it's wrapped up in symbols, but it's not money. And the fact is it has its own curious category. It's called quasi-money. And we don't get it because we can't. That system is paved over. So what about what all of this implies? I mean, this is the aspect that titillates the ironist the most. It's the short-sightedness of the Indian who gave away his birthright, the whole island of Manhattan, which is now, some of the most expensive square feet in the galaxy, for a handful of junk. I mean, the Lenape got took because evidently the Lenape weren't, This is a bias that's baked into the city. If you go into Central Park, you can see this. Now, this is Shakespeare by John Quincy Adams Ward, and when they unveiled it, the presenter said, "Come down to the phrenologist of the present day, and they tell you of the visible indications of his invention, his sympathy, his wit." If you know what phrenology is, then you understand what he's getting at here with visible indications. Phrenology was this crackpot theory that your character is echoed in the shapes of your skull. It was big business in New York in the 19th century, and what we're meant to remark in Shakespeare is the perfect dome of his high genius forehead. The higher, the better. So if Shakespeare is maximum genius, it's one of the startling little facts of this city that we have just a few yards away, the perfect contrasting example, and perfect because everything else is equal. It's bronze, it's the same scale, it's also by John Quincy Adams Ward, and it's this, Indian Hunter, okay? Now, here things get very revealing. This whole idea of high forehead means intelligent, now we know that that's garbage, that's history. But it has given us terms that we still use today. A lot of real estate in the forehead, highbrow, smarty pants. The opposite, primitive, unsophisticated, dull, lowbrow. Now, were the Lenape dull? A warrior could shoot 6 arrows by the time a Dutchman could reload a musket. Now, more than one guy found that out the hard way. What would you do with a cattail? Well, they ate the roots, made diapers from the tufts, and rope from the leaves. They were maximizers. They were engineers. They would farm in one place, burn another to enrich the soil, and live in a third. And over the generations, they had burned and rejuvenated about 90% of Manhattan by the time the Dutch showed up. Not dull. Different. They believed in a spirit that rode through the forest on a stag, and his job was to calm the animals of the terror of being killed for food. Now imagine the culture that produces that. They believed that the Milky Way was a trail to the afterlife, and every star was the footprint of a ghost. Now these things are worth imagining, and they don't take a lot of effort to learn about. I think so much better than just taking the same tired idea and passing it on to the next guy. I mean, it's worth considering the name of this neighborhood, this rarity, and trying to peer through it, even if it's a blurry image, at a totally different world. It's worth knowing that this is the wrong headdress. It's worth knowing that this isn't money. And it's worth knowing that nobody can tell you this guy's real name. Thank you.